Hey, so welcome back to the channel here. So this is a follow-up or maybe a second video. This is just another video on the subject of how your rights, at least in the United States Constitution, are not just ideas, okay? Now, I made a video about this already, so be prepared for me to get very repetitive because I'm probably going to be making the same point over and over. And if you feel like, hey, I get the point and you want to click out, you want to go do other things, more power to you. I've only seen about 4 to 5 minutes of this video that I'm going to be commenting on. And it's not off to a very good start. So I haven't seen the whole 17 minutes, 30 seconds. But this video is titled Andrew and Tim Pool Talk Rights on Timcast IRL. Okay. So this is on the channel The Crucible, which is this Andrew Wilson characters channel. Okay. Go check out my other video. It's titled Your Rights Are Not Just Ideas. And I'm actually commenting on an essay written by another guy named Andrew Wilson. So take that for what it is, and let's just get into this here. Go ahead.
This idea of rights as a United States citizen, these are really just constructions of the mind. There's no such thing as an actual right. It doesn't exist outside of some axiomatic kind of philosophical principled belief, right? I have the axiom that I have inalienable rights, and so therefore I have them.
Disagree.
Okay, and we can get into that in a second. But to finish my point, okay, based on this, we kind of suspend them all the time and then kind of pretend like we don't. We let cops be judge, jury, and executioner in many moments and kind of excuse them from it. If there's something which is going on that's in such a state of emergency, we'll suspend the constitutional rights of people in a moment's notice. We'll send the Japanese to internment camps. We will do all of those things because we've done it. We'll suspend your constitutional rights in a second if we think we need to.
Okay. So I don't agree that rights are just axioms. They are a recognition. So in the Declaration of Independence, it says these are self-evident truths that all men are created equal. So what they mean by that is that no matter what race or sex or anything, any culture, doesn't matter, all human beings are born with a natural ability to communicate, to work, to make choices, to defend themselves, to build, to do whatever humans do, right? At some level, we are all equal. We're all the same species. He says they're just axiom ideas and that we suspend the Constitution all the time. Well, that's sort of true. Our government likes to try to do that. They try to pass bills. Last year, the Restrict Act was pretty much shot down, thankfully. But if you look into that bill, it was also called the TikTok ban. And I think maybe there's another TikTok ban that they tried to impose. But the first one was called the Restrict Act, and that was from last year. And that's a good example of where the government tries to be as anti-constitutional as possible. We're always taking bills and cases to the Supreme Court to review. So there's a back and forth. And the founding people were correct that it's the government right now who is trying to push away our rights or try to walk all over them. Most people like to indulge their natural abilities, communication, commerce, building, even destroying, and just being able to live their lives and be left alone. That's what most people want. Anyway, let's continue here. His argument is that rights are just ideas, and he's also going to say, I think that rights are just force. They're a little bit more than that, but let's keep going here.
Which, by the way, that would be my argument for how I know rights aren't real anyway. But we will, and we just kind of excuse it.
But there's a correction here. Government-enshrined protections are not real. Rights that as we know them, are just things that we recognize as things of value to us. So, for instance, I usually define it as simply, you have a right to speak freely. If you're in the middle of the woods and you're buck naked, you can say whatever you want. You have a right to keep and bear arms. Pick up a stick, sharpen it, pointy stick, you can defend yourself. Ain't no one going to stop you. The question is, when you get into conflict with someone else, where is that line drawn? So the reality is, rights are recognized as things that we can and must do to survive and maximize potential.
I think rights are force.
Okay, so Tim is saying that rights are values or things that we value to survive, and he's on the right track. We all have the ability to pick up a stick and defend ourselves, right? We have hands, we have brains, we can build things. That is a natural ability we have. Those are the things that the Declaration of Independence calls self-evident truths, right? Truths that are self-evident. So, in terms of values, the Constitution, what constitutes the foundation of the United States of America, is to recognize that we all have these abilities and that we should be able to use them, at least to a certain degree, without being oppressed by the government. Obviously, you don't just want to whack anybody in the face with a stick that you don't like how they did their hair, right? It's supposed to be a society. I shouldn't have to spell it out like this, okay? But for some reason, I think most of the reason here is that Andrew Wilson is promoting this idea that, unfortunately, a lot of Christians have. Maybe not a whole lot of them. Maybe only a minority of them do. Because I happen to know that a lot of Christians are actually pretty normal people, most of them. But there are, smaller minority fringe groups of Christians who you'd call Jesus freaks. And one of their arguments is that, okay, well, you believe in your rights, don't you? And you say, yes. Okay. Because if you're saying you don't believe in God or you don't believe in religious deities, then they say, well, you believe in your rights, don't you? They try to trick you into thinking, oh, well, if you believe in rights, then how can you argue in believing in a matter of faith? Well, to play devil's advocate or to actually play into their argument to make it better, the Christian's argument is that you have faith in a society that recognizes a smaller government and more opportunity and freedom for people to do things versus a bigger government with more restrictions. Well, it's not just a matter of faith. If we look at history, we see that no other country in the world has ever written anything like the United States Constitution, and it still stands as one of the greatest documents ever written. People are going to argue against everything I say. Everything you say on the internet, people are going to argue. Somebody out there is going to find some bullshit reason to argue, but it stands to this day that the United States has a lot of freedom. It still does have a lot of freedom that other countries don't. So, it doesn't have to be a matter of faith. It's a matter of proof over time that this has worked. And I personally, I don't like it when people call the United States an experiment. It's not an experiment, okay? It's a country. It's the greatest country in the world. I think I've said this before. But anyway, Andrew's going to start talking about how rights are force. They're just force. So let's hear that. God help us.
And I think that
You think rights are forced?
Government
Yeah, rights are
protection.
What do you mean rights are
You're
rights are
explaining.
forced?
You're talking about government
no,
protection.
I'm talking about period. I'll explain what I mean. A right to me is an entitlement absent duty. That's a right. Okay, you're entitled to it, but you have no duty.
What does that mean?
It
Yeah.
means that you have it. So, like, okay,
Entitlement to speak.
yeah. So, if you have a right to own a gun,
To speak.
no, hang on, let me finish. If you have a right to own a gun, do you have a duty to own a gun?
What do you have a duty to speak?
No, you don't
start
have a
with the
duty
First
to
Amendment.
speak.
If you have a right
No.
to vote, do you have a duty
So
to
you-
vote? The
so
answer
right,
is
so
yes.
it'd be an
that's
entitlement.
your argument.
It's an entitlement
But
absent a duty.
but you can speak,
Yeah, you can
and so
until you
the-
can't.
The question.
until somebody stops you with force.
So you're talking about government restrictions are made up by
No,
us as a people.
Just people can adhere to your rights without any form of government. If you're walking down the street and you speak, and a guy turns around and smacks you in the mouth and breaks your jaw, right? He has now used force against whatever this right you think you have to speak. You have no right to do shit except whatever you can enforce.
Right.
Your mechanism is force, and the mechanism against you is force.
And so-
all rights are is force.
You're talking about government protections, not rights.
No, I'm talking about rights. What is a right?
So
What is it?
it is an intrinsic moral function,
Well, okay,
or
intrinsic meaning what?
meanings. If again, I'll try to explain. If you're born and you live in the middle of the woods, there are things you can do. You can hunt for food. You can defend yourself. You can speak freely. Now, what we've done in the United States
Unless
is
you're born blind and you can't talk, right? Then where does your right to speak come from?
Okay, so this whole thing is breaking down here at 3 minutes and 10 seconds. So the argument is, well, Tim is actually on the right track here. Okay, if we look at self-evident truths that all men are created equal. Okay, so we all have the ability, if we look at the word ability, to understand constitutional rights. You have the ability to speak, you have the ability to build a cabin, you have the ability to defend yourself. And then Andrew's argument, of course, is, well, where do your rights come from if somebody just punches you in the face? And you'll notice he gets very aggressive when he talks about this subject. And, I've seen a lot of his videos and he makes a lot of good points, and it's mostly entertainment. I've watched him on his channel, The Crucible, and also on the Whatever podcast. But I think there is an agenda here to try to alter people's understanding of what constitutional rights are. Well, Tim is on the right track. He says they're intrinsic. He means that they are innate. So you have innate abilities to speak. He says, well, what if you're blind, or whatever? Well, generally, unless you're totally comatose, even then, the right in constitutional terms is the recognition that all people have some ability to do these things, and they should have more, they should have less restriction than more restriction to do certain things. Those are the constitutional rights. Now, the recognition part of that, the part to agree to those terms, might lean more into his idea that they are just axioms or ideas. But the human brain has the ability to process reality on some level, okay? So our ability to understand reality, to see what is good and bad, I've told feminists and Christians alike, I don't need a moral compass. I don't need a Bible. I don't need these things to understand what's good and bad in this world. In some situations, it might be questionable or hard to decide. And, sometimes life puts you between a rock and a hard place, and you've got to do what you can. But you always try to do, if you're a good person, you try to do what's more humane. And every person makes their own choices, but we all have the ability to make those choices, no matter where we are, what we do. And so I would say the part that's faith, to have faith that is just an idea, is, again, entrusting that the American people are going to take the responsibility to keep their government in check in order to stop tyranny. That we have faith in each other as a society. It's hard to do when society's breaking down all over around you and people are closed off and won't talk to each other and just want to freak out and distance themselves and tribalize. So it's getting harder to do that. But it's not just a matter of faith, because a lot of people are speaking and a lot of people are able to articulate reality. Okay. You know, for example, I could just ignore politics and make this entire thing just about, you know, my Jurassic Park games and stuff or whatever. But these are very difficult times, and there's a lot of bullshit out there. So it's very important for people to have different perspectives and compare them. And I always promote people to see what's realistic, you know, what falls in line with reality. Because you can join any tribe you want, right? You can join any group, but which groups are going to be more realistic? You know, who's more in line with reality? So that's where Andrew Wilson's trying to come off here, is like, I'm in tune with reality, you know, rights are just force. And so here he's getting really aggressive and he's trying to use a forceful will on Tim. Now, Tim, in his defense, he's actually on the right track. Okay. He's talking about what's innate. It's just neither of these guys are articulating it, that you have innate abilities as a person. And it's in plain English. I feel kind of silly having to spell this out for everybody, but there it is. It's in plain English in the Declaration of Independence. So let's keep going here.
You lack the ability to speak,
Right.
but you still have the means by which you are allowed to do it.
Yeah, but what makes it an intrinsic right to be?
What makes it an intrinsic right is that most people are born with the ability to speak. And if they can't speak, they can write. And if they can't write, they can use sign language or body language or something, unless they are in a complete coma. And even if they were in a coma, if at some point they wake up or they're able to get out of that coma in some way, they still have the ability to wiggle their fingers or something. No one's going to say, hey, you were in a coma, you're not allowed to speak anymore. Who's going to do that, and why? Why would they? You know, if you want to get down to the micron nitpicking part of this whole aspect, then I guess, you know, the doctors have the right to say you can't speak because you're disabled, because that's what the law is. And then using force to do that, which I agree. I think that force plays into rights, but I disagree that rights are just force. I think it's more in line of what Tim is saying. They are abilities that you have and a recognition that you should be able to do those things with less limitation and more opportunity. Okay, and who gets to force in our, you know, in our Constitution? Well, it's the people. It's both the government and the people, but the people, okay? It's about creating opportunity and about putting certain restrictions on government in order to prevent tyranny upon the people, in order to create a free state. State means a way of living, a way of life. It doesn't really mean government. The context is more of a state of living, of a society. It's state of being. Freedom in the Constitution means freedom from tyranny. Rights mean you can do these things and be left alone about it by the government and other people. If they don't like what you say, they can walk away. They don't like what you say or type on the internet, they can mute or block you. They shouldn't have to be condemned or banned because of what they say, even if it is hateful, even if it is bad. Mute them, block them. No, it does damage, it does all this. words are not violence. Violence is physical. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that stuff. This world has just lost its mind completely. So let's keep going here.
Be able to do, like, where does this idea come from other than you axiomatically kind of just
Evolution?
say, you say because I can do something, I have the right to do something?
Okay, well, when they founded this country, supposedly all these people who were trying to form our nation, they did research on history and found that when people are allowed to speak and allowed to indulge commerce and make more and more choices for themselves, things were generally better than when there were tyrannical governments. In the case of Europe, royalty and the church, which is what people were trying to get away from. I explained that in another video about misconceptions of the early colonists, of North America. So they didn't just kind of axiomatically come up with this shit. So he's wrong about that. They put a lot of time and effort and thought and careful focus into the formation of our Constitution.
It's part of a evolutionary biological structure
So
that
if I-
resulted in the survival of
So
humanity.
if I like grab a spear and I can stab somebody with it, I have a right to?
No, that's
Why?
that's
That's
attacking
different.
somebody. That's
Yeah,
violating.
but other
that's a
than
whole
an
bunch-
axiom of you shouldn't do that because I just don't feel like you should, what makes it intrinsic that I don't do that?
that you don't go and kill another person.
Yeah.
So the way I view rights would be things that
Well, here's the thing, okay? In particular circumstances, according to laws, you can defend yourself under particular circumstances. And it is government that tries to take those things away from us more and more. They create laws. Like in many states, apparently you can't form a militia. You can't go out into public places in large groups and train. Even though it says that a well-regulated militia, and they don't mean regulated by government, they mean people who are responsible, regular men, regular people forming into a group and training and being safe and responsible themselves. That's what they mean by well-regulated. They don't mean a government regulating it. You have got to be kidding me. There are some dumb, made-up points in current political rhetoric, and that is definitely one of them. They did not mean a government regulating a militia. Just shut the fuck up. Anyway, when you have a right, well, you have a right to defend yourself, and you have the ability to defend yourself. The right part comes in, as Tim was saying, what's the circumstance here? Well, and then Andrew's saying, well, what's your right? Well, you have a right to make a choice not to. That's another ability that you have. And under particular circumstances, you have rights to do things and be left alone. That's what it's about. Now, obviously, within reason, I have a right, I'm just going to go out and do this. And that's where I don't like the argument. It's falling apart because they have to move something that is understandable and logical and then try to shift it into a realm of nonsense in order to try to create an argument. And it's really dumb. Anyway, let's keep going here.
and again, there's a debate over what rights are.
Yeah, let's start with that. What are they?
No. So there, it's honestly difficult to define,
Yeah.
but it is certain moral structures or.
How about you just read the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights? Dude, just pull it up. You have the technology. Pull it up. Read it. I did in my last video on the subject. It's not hard to do.
I would say axioms. Would you agree with that? Just an axiom. So, like, you have inalienable rights from God according to the Constitution. This is an axiomatic principle. It means this is our like philosophical starting point, is that we have these.
Well, if you want to bring God into it, but it says creator also, that means it doesn't matter if you think Cthulhu made mankind, or, you know, if you think our whole universe is just on a hard drive in some soy nerd's freaking computer and we're all inside some kind of matrix and God is some kind of other being, or if there isn't a God, or you believe in spaghetti monster, I don't know. Whatever you believe created, okay? You have a right to believe whatever created everything. That's a right that you have. You are not forced to be one thing or another. You don't go to jail for being an atheist. Now, Christians have tried to argue with me that, you know, this country wasn't supposed to be atheist, that it was never intended to be atheist. What they intended was that the government not have any religious bias one way or another. And I say feminism is a religion. And so there is a lot of religious bias. And again, I don't believe, okay, here's a belief of mine. If we're going to go along with what the Constitution says, then we shouldn't have "In God We Trust" on our money. I don't think people should be banned from believing in God, but it shouldn't be in our governance. It's supposed to be a personal matter. Okay. But he's bringing God into this thing and trying to call it an axiom again. But what it means is that no matter what people believe, the government is not allowed to have religious bias. And so it is not allowed to make religious decisions, nor is it allowed to ban religious practice, so as long as that practice doesn't involve hurting anyone. I'm going to let these guys talk for a while, because this is about the point where I kind of left off and decided, okay, I'll do this video, and we'll just kind of go through this. I'm not even sure I want to cover the whole video. I mean, it's a pretty simple point, you know, and these guys have, well, Andrew Wilson here has to take it into strange territory to try to make it look like a bunch of axiomatic, yada whatever bullshit, and it just kind of breaks the whole thing apart. Anyway, let's keep going.
I would put it as things that were required or greatly beneficial to the survival of an individual that we greatly benefit.
I agree.
It's-
We
it's-
benefit. I just don't know what makes them intrinsic, or like you're born with them or something like this, other than we just kind of agree to it.
So I think the restrictions we kind of agree to. And some people might view some things as rights and other things not as rights. Like the left thinks healthcare is a human right, which makes literally no sense.
No sense.
But in terms of your ability to speak, you can walk around, you can speak, to defend yourself, you can pick up a stick, you can defend
But
yourself.
this goes back to the same argument. I can grab a spear and murder somebody. I can do that. Why don't I have a right to do that?
Because you are now causing harm to another person, which is a detriment.
But why is that valuable?
Why are other people valuable?
Yeah, well, why would that be an intrinsic value? So, like, I can
one
envision
would
a
result in the
planet,
end of
for
humanity,
instance-
and one results in the expansion of humanity.
Well, no, both can result in the expansion of humanity.
Right, but absolutely not. You're completely wrong.
No, I'm completely right.
You are wrong. Self-defense can result in expansion of humanity if you're using destruction for the purpose of ending something that is destructive. But if you are wantonly going around murdering people, you're actively reducing and harming humanity.
Well, okay, but that doesn't mean
So it
that
doesn't-
you couldn't expand humanity by harming people. There's
So
nations
the argument
that
of
do this all the
self-defense
time.
is there are things that we believe we must be able to do for the betterment and survival of humanity.
Yeah, but when I'm asking you this question, right, I'm asking the foundation from which you say, I have the right to speak or write.
We
or
need to be able to in
things like
order to
this.
survive.
You because you need to do something.
So
I'm not sure how that means you have a right to it, though.
Okay, so speech is not
Like you have
just
to
saying
eat.
words.
You have
Speech
a right to eat.
Yes, 100%.
Really? You have a right to do that?
Why would you
Yes,
not
you don't have a right to own
do
So
that?
if I
food,
had-
but you have a right to eat, otherwise you'll die.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
Do you have a right to breathe? What about breathing?
These are good questions, right?
Again, I don't think you understand. We're talking about intrinsic behaviors that are required for survival versus the government and humans deciding what we shouldn't have.
I
on
don't think we're
laws.
speaking past each other. I'm asking what makes them intrinsic. When you say I have a right to eat, okay?
If you don't, you'll die.
If you have if that guy has all the food over there, you no longer have a right
We are not
to eat.
talking about your right to steal from others. If
Yeah,
you are
so you
standing
no longer
in
have
the
a right
woods
to
by
eat?
If you're standing in the woods by yourself, eat that mushroom.
Okay, got it. You can eat the mushroom.
Uh-huh.
But what makes it a right to eat that mushroom? And what makes it not a right for guys standing next to the mushroom to say,
Okay,
I have a
you're talking
gun
about
and I
laws?
don't want you
Okay,
to
wait,
eat
hold on.
that mushroom?
You're now once again talking about laws and restrictions.
Yeah, okay, but my whole theory is that rights themselves are force, and that's all they ever are. It's just your ability to use force to do thing you want to do.
I think you're just making
you call
an
that a
argument
right.
I call rights things that are essential to the survival of humanity.
So you have a right to your heart beating and your blood flowing and to blink and to.
Yes.
Okay, so if you
So
just.
now you misunderstand because once again you're talking about government again.
How is this government? It doesn't need to be government.
If you are standing in the middle of the woods and your heart is beating, your heart has a right to beat. If your heart fails and you die, you died. If you're making an argument that someone should or should not be allowed to do something is an entirely human social construct.
I agree.
Right. I'm saying that the reason we have protections of rights is because we've determined certain things are required for the reasonable survival and expansion of humanity.
I agree. We agree to those things, and we act as though they're rights.
And the Bill of Rights.
But I don't think rights themselves exist.
The Bill of Rights is a recognition of certain things that we do for the betterment of survival that must be protected from government. Now, if you want to argue the amendments in the Bill of Rights are nonsensical, fine. If you want to have a moral argument or philosophical argument about what is required or intrinsic to the survival of humanity, by all means have that argument. But rights do exist. It just means some you might not agree with and some you might think aren't. Those are philosophical debates.
Yeah, but when you say exist, right? Do you mean outside of your brain they exist, or do they only exist as a construction of your mind where you say, I have a right to do X?
If we observe creatures in the wild, we will see them required to do things to survive.
Yeah, okay, so
if you inhibit those things, they will die.
So if just rights
protect
to you,
those things.
So the rights to you just mean things which are a requirement for your existence?
And typically we define them as such because they transcend the basic obvious things like breathing and drinking water.
Owning a gun isn't a requirement to your existence.
No, defending yourself is.
Yeah, but
if a bear comes and you're in the middle of the woods and you don't have the ability to defend yourself, you cease to exist and humans cease to exist. So humans do defend themselves. Then as human society, we've decided this should be protected, otherwise humans will cease to exist.
Yeah, but why? Okay, but this makes no sense, right? So if all right is to you, Tim, is thing X which is necessary for the survival of a man, in this case blinking and breathing and eating and pooping and whatever, the right to poop shall not be under, because you have a right to do that because it's like something you need to do to be alive.
Right, but you can't poop on someone's floor.
Why couldn't you extend that to literally everything? You need healthcare to survive. You need guns to survive. You need a house to survive. You need everything to survive.
I think we should move on, but I think the challenge is, I don't know if you're unwilling to understand or what. You have no right to take other things from other people, to take their labor. You have no right to force a doctor to perform surgery on you, but you certainly have a right to ask him for it.
Those are just assertions. Like, you just assert these things as though they have a grounding epistemic foundation from which you can make the assertion. Based on where do you make the assertion that you're not allowed to do X other than because Tim Pool's preference is that you don't?
And I'm literally saying you're talking about laws and social order right now, not human behaviors for survival.
I think human behaviors are laws and social orders. I think that's this. You're saying the same thing.
No, if a person was in the middle of the woods, they'd be foraging and looking for food.
Yeah, what does that have to do with what I just said?
You're talking about what the government can and can't do. I'm talking about what humans need to do to survive.
Yeah, okay. Well, humans also have to have other humans around to survive.
And so this is communication is essential. The right to defend yourself is essential. The right to secure your possessions is essential.
Okay, so you can see this whole argument between both of them just went insane. Why don't we just look at rights for what they are? They are a collective agreement, and Andrew Wilson is correct about that. On some level, they are an agreement, right? They aren't, what is he saying they're not? He's saying they're not real, but they are. Okay, that it does exist in reality. We do have an agreement on these things. He's saying that when it's convenient for certain people, they just throw it out and use force. And I think force, again, is a part of it. Maybe half of it. Maybe more than half. But let's just look at what it means in the Declaration of Independence. Now, if you want to talk about it outside of United States politics and the world or just human beings in general, I would say that rights, generally speaking, are a social agreement about who can do what. And so, is it just force? Well, no. I mean, this person is allowed to garden and this person isn't. So that's where those agreements happen. But then people disagree and then force comes into play. He says rights don't exist. Well, in terms of our United States Constitution, they do. And it is an agreement that you can do things up to a certain level, right? You can defend yourself. And in our Constitution, the government is not allowed to stop you from being able to keep and bear arms or speak or have press or religion. To argue against a point he made in another video, which I can't find for the life of me, it was a short where he was on the Whatever podcast and he's talking to a girl. And I've searched and searched and searched, and maybe YouTube knows I've been searching for this video and won't let me see it, or maybe it got deleted. I don't know. I gave up. But he was talking to her and saying, okay, it's okay if you believe the Bible is just an idea, just so as long as you believe your rights are just an idea. Well, why does he choose rights? Why didn't he choose some other subject? Something's going on here. There's an agenda. And whenever it comes to this thing, he gets very aggressive about it. So I want to clarify that it's both, okay? One part is an ideal agreement. The other part is the human brain can process reality, and we can see that when people are able to speak, people have a better chance of being able to defend their country, their society against tyranny from within or foreign or domestic. That when people can share ideas, that those words and ideas can have an impact and spread knowledge about what's true and what's not, as to stop an evil government that might try to brainwash its society to become weak and disposable, rather than one that is educated and capable. Okay? That's why we have rights in this country. So we can retain our freedom from tyranny, so that the government can't do things that they would normally do to prevent people from defending themselves. In this case, rights are laws and foundational agreements. Do those agreements exist? Are they real? Yes. They're real. As long as people are in the action of agreeing with those things, but then Wilson says, no, people can throw that out. Well, they can, but people can defend themselves, and they have been defending themselves. And they have been going by the books. They've been taking things to the Supreme Court and whatnot. People have been going through the system that we've created, the one that is, in my view, insanely corrupt, but still doing it nonetheless. And this is also part of human nature, which is a real thing. We create society, we create laws and things. Some of it is headspace and some of it is real. Our ability to do things, to speak, to defend, to work, to earn, to travel, to build our lives and make choices are things we all have an innate ability to do, whether we decide to hit somebody with a stick or choose not to. We have that ability. And that part is the self-evident truth. All people are capable of this. Okay, on some level. That's what they mean by all people are equal. We already are. We already have these abilities. Now, when we start talking about left ideas, they're more about an equality of outcome for every single person, which is not logical. All right, well, we'll keep watching a little bit here and see what they say.
These things, without them, humans cease to function properly, and then you get the Soviet bloc, you get starvation, you get genocides,
It's
and
also
this is a
just
detriment
it's
to.
a function of our belief system.
Well, it's not just a function of our belief system, and Tim Pool is actually on the right track here. When governments become powerful, the people who suffer the most aren't always the foreign people that these governments conquer. It's actually the people in their realm that the government rules over who suffer the most and suffer the worst. And one of the worst cases is Russian history. You want to look at something bad. Look at what Russian government has done to their people. It's a bad history. And I saw a meme maybe a week ago, and I wish I could pull it up here and show you, but the meme was just a picture of these, these paintings, these portraits of people from a long time ago. And one of them, a British guy says, I'll fight, I'll die for honor. The French guy says, I will die for love. The American guy says, I'll die for freedom. And then the Russian guy says, I will die. You get the idea. So, yes, this is what happens. And what Tim is saying is that the rights exist to protect people against tyranny, at least in our Constitution. That we recognize people have these innate abilities, and that there should be limitation on government, just how much they can infringe on those things, so that people can live normal lives and not have to worry about when the government's going to punish them for some insanely idiotic bullshit. And it is, like she's saying, it is a part of our belief system, but it's also the reality of what we are as people. And I think a lot of it does come down to other things. It's not just whether we have an agreement that people should be able to do things to a certain point, but also if a human society is prepared to evolve itself or devolve, it's going to fluctuate up and down, right? So how educated are people and how refined are people, like mentally and physically? Do people know how to do a lot of stuff? Can they comprehend a lot of things? Can they keep themselves busy being productive, or are they going to, fall into a society of tyranny? And there's all sorts of tyranny. I mean, in third world countries, you have all kinds of violence and problems and people ruling who are violent and crazy because that society hasn't developed enough in order to become productive and peaceful. It comes down to education, not just your knowledge in skills, but how much training do you have, right? What does your population look like? Are they dumb, or are they smart? Are they a bunch of drug addicts, or are they hardworking people? And a lot of the time, I think people think it's government. Is the government doing their job to keep people educated? Well, actually, it's really up to the people. Do you want to have a good community or not? Are you, as a community, going to do something about education? Because when you put it all into the government's hands, it devolves into propaganda. And that's happening right now with our school system. There's no denying that our education system is a propaganda machine. I've been through it. I've been through the university system. I have a degree in speech communication I got from Oregon State University, graduated in 2012. And I can tell you right now that universities are nothing but feminist brainwashing camps. That's all they are. Anyway, let's keep going again.
In the United States, that we have natural rights. I mean,
I agree with that.
That's a huge part of
I
it.
agree with that. I agree with that, that in the United States, we agree that
But I
we
think
have
that
them.
you can say, I think you can
Not
say that
sure that we
everyone,
do.
I think that you can say that everyone has these rights, and it's a function of whether or not their government allows the rights to be recognized.
That's the contention. When you
So-
say, I think everybody has these rights.
Yeah, that is my belief.
Yeah, it's a belief
Yeah,
based on
based on existence. I mean,
based on just your preferences.
So
right?
there's
I don't think
in
it's
the-
a
in the- in the
preference. I
big-
think everyone has a right to breathe and
in the
blink.
and you do
and
in the
eat.
big picture of what are the list of fundamental rights that exist to humans, cultures debate these things wildly, but there are a small handful which are true and correct. If inhibited, a person dies
Agreed. But what I'm saying, I guess my overarching point, and I can just kind of tie
or
it off
society
with this,
fails.
is that when I say rights are forced, what I'm saying is the thing that you say is necessary, breathing, eating, these types of things. I think that those things, which you call rights, really are just force. You're saying I will use force in order to do this thing that I want to do to necessarily exist. And that another person can use force to stop those things from existing.
And then
if-
you can use force to stop them.
Right, and then you can use force, et cetera,
you
et
have a
cetera.
right to
But all we're
self-defense.
really doing is just moving the goalpost of force around, right? So if this group says this group does not have the right to breathe, they do not have the right to eat, they do not have the right to do any of this shit, and they go and put a stop to it,
But you don't.
what
but
are
that
we
group,
appealing to for
but that
why it
group
is that you
doesn't-
can't do that?
That group doesn't have the right to do
Yeah,
that.
but that makes no sense.
Like
Why
you're
wouldn't they
saying-
have the
you're
right
saying-
to do that?
I
You're
feel
saying,
you're
you're saying might makes right, which is a
Well, it's
perspective.
beyond
makes-
that. I think you're making
it
a
makes-
postmodernist argument for why you should be allowed to do things that other people don't want you to do.
I think no, I think the opposite is true.
I'm making
I would use a justification of God, and I would appeal to something which is unchanging and an unchanging standard for moral justifications for oughts. But what you're doing when you say a right and you're appealing to like the Constitution, that's postmodernist subjective standards of nonsense, right? It's just like
No, it's moral
we all
foundation.
decided that we have these rights, so we do. There's no justification for any of them.
so
Zero.
you don't believe in any intrinsic moral foundations?
No, I do believe.
Okay, so this argument is getting pretty silly again. He's saying there's no justification for any of our rights. Of course there is. And that girl is correct. How about reality? Okay. The founding people looked at reality and they looked at history and said, people need to be able to speak. The government needs to be limited in its power in certain areas because they always abuse these things. They always try to silence people and beat people down, prevent them from defending themselves, prevent them from traveling, prevent them from getting together and protesting, even peaceably. They do it so they can keep power and have the ability to continue abusing people over and over again. So that's reality. There is justification for it. I think I agree with this dude when he talks about other things, but in this argument, he's not totally wrong, but he's just taking points that he's right about and stretching them so far that they become ridiculous.
And intrinsic moral foundations and epistemic justifications and ontological justifications which would come from God.
I think you're doing deconstructivist reasoning to argue why.
This is just basic philosophy. It has nothing to do with deconstruction or postmodernism. Basic philosophy, you have to have a justification for a position.
And when I've given you one, you just reject it
No,
every
yeah,
time.
well,
You just-
I suppose people could make the argument that this is all philosophy. I personally don't give a shit about philosophy. You can figure out what's good and bad, and if you have half a working brain, you probably could do it. And so, I don't think philosophy is that necessary. Okay, I'm sure a lot of people. How are we going to? What are we going to do about society? How are we going to blah blah blah? How are we going to have a society without philosophy? I don't give a shit. Most of what we live by is technological. We didn't really need philosophy that much to develop technology. Now, that's my view. Maybe you could prove that, no, it's because of philosophy. Well, what these Christians try to do right now is say, because the founding fathers were Christian and they held Christian values, that's where the Constitution came from when they wrote it. And I would say maybe a little bit, but I think they were trying to actually get away from a dogmatic way of thinking and more into a practical one where that stuff wasn't necessary. What if there's people who aren't religious? And if we are all equal, no matter what religion we're from, what do we agree on? What things should we be able to do, within good reason, as any person? So any religion is allowed to be practiced as long as, you're not hurting anybody. The government should have limitations on its religious bias. That's where our Constitution stands. The Constitution isn't a philosophy. It's a recognition that in certain areas, the government always proves to be abusive when they are allowed too much control over certain things, like being able to silence people, keep people from having guns, stop people from gathering or traveling. Okay? So they chose very specific things to create rights about. All right, moving on.
Because they're axiomatic. So you haven't demonstrated why the axiom or the starting point, we start with rights, Andrew. You haven't demonstrated why we do, other than because I observe that if we don't act in this way, you expire. But it's like, okay, but why is that even bad? Like, why is that even a bad thing?
Why is it bad that humans cease to exist?
Yeah, why would that even be a bad thing from the worldview of rights? Like, oh, okay, if you don't have this right, you die. But you haven't justified why that's even a bad thing.
Because humans exist through a pattern of evolution towards...
So he's getting into the microcosm bullshit here. He's trying to reduce things down to these really crazy, stupid arguments. And why is it a bad thing if people die from a point of view of rights? I'm not even going to get into this. I think his argument is just breaking down so bad he doesn't even know how to defend it. I mean, you could say, well, would it be bad if humans went extinct? I mean, maybe it would be a good thing, but that's a whole different topic. Would it be good or bad? It would be both. I mean, if people did up and go extinct suddenly, and we didn't have time to really do anything about certain problems like nuclear power plants and nuclear arsenals and all that stuff, that stuff would eventually leak radiation all over the place, and it would probably cause some damage. I'm not going to say that all life would cease to exist, but we've had such an impact that there would be both good and bad consequences of us passing. That's a whole different thing, and I'm not even sure what the hell he's talking about here anymore. I'm not even sure Andrew Wilson knows what he's talking about. He quit making sense a long time ago. He's made a couple good points, like if you want to enforce your rights, that's okay. I would say the best way to protect your rights, actually, to his point, is to indulge your rights, to do them, to speak, to keep arms, to travel, to do. The more people indulge these things and the more people learn to refine themselves when they do these things and be responsible and logical adults about it, that's the best way to protect your rights. Okay? And that's not so much force against somebody else, so much as refining yourself, and doing a thing. Because when it becomes a norm, say everybody just open carried all the time, and it was a normal thing. You could say, well, people would have shootouts all the time. And would they? Was the Wild West really as violent as portrayed in the movies? Some say it wasn't, because people had guns. If everybody has a gun and people start some shit, everybody can get up and say, knock it off. That could also turn into tyranny of the people, right? it could swing both ways, but ultimately, I mean, just on another note outside of this, I would say, yeah, we would want to try to do something like that to educate people on how to be responsible with guns before we ban guns altogether. And that's the debate over rights. What do you have the right to do? Anyway, yeah, this whole thing's falling apart. So let's just keep going.
Or creation, whichever you decide, to be fruitful, to bear fruit, and etc. These things are components of creation and life. I think this aligns perfectly with like a Judeo-Christian moral worldview, and I think these things are requirements for the efficient expansion and fruitfulness of humans. So they are natural, either from an evolutionary standpoint. Humans developed to inherit certain requirements to function efficiently. And when these things are curtailed, we see inefficiency and collapse, disease, and chaos.
This is circular. So you go, okay, we need to bear fruit and multiply. Why? Well, because then we can exist. Why do we need to exist? Because then we can bear fruit and multiply. Okay, but why? Because then we can exist.
You're just being contrarian for no reason.
No, it's not contrarian. I'm giving you a real principle.
You believe in God?
Yeah, I'm a Christian.
So if I say God gives you a mandate,
Christian.
so when God says has a mandate to be fruitful and multiply, do you say yes or no?
Yeah, of course.
Are there certain characteristics and behaviors that result?
Just 1 second. There's a lot of buzzing that's coming through. I don't know if you can pick it up on the microphone. I'm going to go ahead and go close the window real fast because there's actually finally something really interesting here about the whole subject that should actually be addressed. Okay, so what they're talking about here is the subject of life. So Andrew's saying, well, it's circular, we need to do this and that, and we keep going back and here. And Tim is saying, well, rights are about, your ability to survive and blah, blah, blah. How about I just open this up for them? Okay. Because they're getting close, but this is why they created the Constitution. This is why we have rights. The difference is government versus people, but here it is, okay? I asked a group of people a long time ago, and I might have actually done this a few times, but I've asked people, what's the meaning of life? And they often say there is no answer, or it's what you make it, or it's too big of a question. And I say the meaning of life is to live well. Every biological creature has a designation to live the way they're supposed to live, whatever they are. And that their natural programming for however they're supposed to live is what we're supposed to enable. Now, unfortunately, a part of our species is that we are a very insecure, compulsive, insane, competitive, war-fearing species. Okay. But actually, most people just want to live regular lives and be left alone. It's governments that don't leave people alone, that continue to pester them and make their life hard. There's other groups of people who do the same thing. There's all different stuff, but going back through history, all the way to the pharaohs, 3,000 years ago, I would argue that the most dangerous and oppressive group in any society is its government when they become corrupt. So what are the rights for? They're on the subject now, so here it is. They are for the embetterment of the people's quality of life. It's that simple. It is that freaking simple. All you have to do is read the Declaration of Independence to understand it. And your brain should be able to click and get it. And it seems like people just can't. I don't know if it's illiteracy or what's going on, but it should not be this hard to figure out. All you should have to do is read the goddamn document to understand what it says. Anyway, let's get back to this. The point of the whole thing is to enable a better quality of life for the people so they don't have to put up with tyranny from the government. That's what rights are. That's what they're for. And he's like, no, they're not real. They're this axiomatic kind of whatever. No, they're not. They're based on reality and history. Actual history. Unfortunately, these people are about promoting their cultural domination over people, so he wants people to think that rights are beliefs like the Bible. I'm sorry, dude, we don't see people rise up from the dead and then ascend to heaven. But we do see these other things going on in the world that need to be addressed. Okay? The Bible and constitutional rights are completely separate things, and I wish people would keep it out of there. I say that about the Christian agenda because there's enough coverage about feminists. I can't stand feminism. I am totally against it. I'm not against women being in power. They keep saying that, oh, women, being educated, being this and that. That's not what feminism is. Feminism is a completely different thing. And I could make another video about that, but I'm switching things around here because there are agendas everywhere. Everybody's got some weird agenda, and here the Christians want to say, no, the Bible's a part of the Constitution. It was here from the beginning, and they should have never made it the way that. There's an agenda. So here we go. Let's finish this up.
And benefit and more efficient, fruitful multiplying.
Of course.
That's
divine, but this is divine command, justification from divine command. It has nothing to do with libertarian nonsense of constitutional egalitarianism.
I think instead of having a discussion on the merits of what rights might mean, you're instead.
So he calls libertarian thinking nonsense, huh? So to have liberty, to have freedom from tyranny is nonsense. And I hear Christians all the time talking about how Christians were so persecuted and mistreated and they didn't have rights for anything. Okay, so wouldn't you want Christians to be free, to be liberated? So they can speak their word of God if they want to? Is that wrong? Is that nonsense? Do you see how ridiculous this man is? And, he makes a lot of good points the rest of the time, but it also doesn't take a freaking genius to see where he's right and wrong either. Anyway, here we go.
Upset over what libertarians think rights might mean as opposed to what I'm actually trying to say.
Okay, well, do you justify rights as coming from God?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, then we're fine there. But so I think we actually agree. So then if that is the case,
Right, so now he suddenly agrees because, Tim's playing into his bias, Christianity. But what the Constitution really means is whatever you believe created you. A lot of people say that the founding fathers were deist. Well, some of them were Christian, maybe some were atheist, maybe some had their own personal beliefs. I think it was Jefferson who said that his religion he says, my religion is my own, and as far as I know, is not shared by any other man and need not be. No matter what they believed, they did the noble thing and tried to do what was right for everybody. So this egalitarianism he's talking about, well, I don't know what part of egalitarianism we're dealing with here. Is it equality of outcome or is it about equality of opportunity? Because equality of outcome is not actually a libertarian thing. It's more of an enforcement. Who gets to enforce the equality of outcome? And that would play into Andrew's point about enforcement. I think libertarianism is more about having opportunity and being responsible and at least having the freedom to choose and deal with your own life instead of someone forcing you to do things, to force you to live a certain way. And the reason there's so much tension now, as I'm making this video at the end of the year, near the end of the year 2024, there's a lot of tension in our country and our times right now because people feel like they don't have any more control over their lives because of what's happening to our economy and our society is falling apart, and just how much bullshit our government and the elites in general, the corporate leaders and all these World Economic Forum people and weirdos like Bill Gates and all these people out there, the elites getting away with all this stuff and all the damage that's been done and all the economic hardship we're going through. And I've always said that if we alleviated a lot of the financial problems in this world, a lot of the tension would disappear. I don't agree that alleviating those problems is going to come from allowing the government to take more of people's money. I think we've already seen what that does, and it's a lot of damage. And I honestly don't have an answer, except smaller government that has very strict incentive to do right by the people, which would be a more constitutional leaning perspective. So anyway, let's keep going.
Whatever you think rights are come from God, then whatever else we're appealing.
Okay, so yeah, he wants to believe your rights come from God, and that's fine. He can believe that, but the Constitution doesn't dictate that rights come from God. It mentions God or your creator, whoever, whatever you believe created you. That's your right to believe in it. No one can force you to be Christian. No one can force you to be an atheist. At least that's the intention.
To external to God for where a right comes from isn't really a right, right? It's not really a right.
I think that life, goodness, creation, there is deep overlap. I think a simple way to look at it is, yin yang, within good there is some evil, within evil there is some good. Mm-hmm. And a way to explain that is sometimes we have to destroy to create. What does that mean? If there's a mass murderer who's murdering children, we don't want to, but we stop that person to defend ourselves and others' lives. I think that there is divine mandate that we must, be fruitful, multiply. We are here to organize, to create. There's a secular way of looking at it. It's evolution that developed us into this point where we have internalized these things that we must do, or that result in a more efficient way of life. Or more simply, there is a God, there is a divine structure and mandate, which results in certain things that are beneficial to mankind that I would describe as good and just, and there are things that are evil and unjust.
So as we get to the heart of it then, right here, where we come to this agreement, where I reject this is that I think all the things you just stated are duties. They're duties. They're the opposite of rights. You have a duty.
I just think we're having a semantic argument.
Well, but semantics are super important so we don't speak past each other. So when I say a duty, it's an obligation to do a thing based on the fact that you're commanded to, in this case by God. A right, I would say, is an entitlement absent duty. So if that's the case, what you're listing out is like God is giving us these duties to do. I'm not sure what rights he's giving you.
I'm saying there are certain behaviors that God, that they're.
So now this is becoming a religious God argument. Now he's saying God gave you commands. Well, our rights aren't about God's commands. I'm going to keep this directed at the United States Constitution. Well, what about people? Because the Constitution does mention that all men are created equal, so that must mean people around the world. Well, yes, and so the Constitution recognizes that all people have the ability to communicate. I've said this before. I also told you I might get pretty repetitive in this video, unfortunately. We only have 30 seconds left exactly in this video here. So, the rights are about an agreement that everybody has innate abilities that should not be infringed on in order to secure a free state of living. Again, state means a state of living. And that freedom means freedom from tyranny. Okay, that was the intention. They didn't say, God put this in the Bible and God says this. And so we must form our Constitution around God's orders. That's not what the rights are about. Rights are about you will be left alone. These are the rules, and they are rules. Are they made up? Yes. Are they total fantasy? No. Because we can see that when people are able to speak freely and share ideas, they are allowed to educate themselves, maybe even educate each other and other people, to spread knowledge so that people can naturally figure out by looking at facts versus opinions, people can start to discern what's real and what's not. And when you have governments that want to propagandize the minds of people, they would rather you not encounter alternative ideas, whatever those alternative ideas are, if they're real or fake. When people are able to indulge information, yes, a lot of people are going to take bias, and they do push away the other side because they're afraid of being wrong. But that information should be there for people nonetheless, because if it isn't, then that's less opportunity that they have in their life to make better decisions for themselves, more informed decisions. And when people have more information, or at least access to reality, they have more opportunity. Even if there is a shitload of misinformation out there, if people have access to what's real on some level, at least they have access to it, and it has proven to better their lives. Now, you need to make examples. Okay, well, how about all the technology we use? Well, it promotes misinformation and opinion. Yes, it does. It's all going to do that. That's a part of our human nature. But what happens is when only one group of people are allowed to speak and no one else is, we wind up with tyranny, and we wind up with a society that is miserable, living in fear. That has been proven. And even now, with all this corruption happening, we have the ability, even with our words, to fight this and end it. So let's end this video here. Let's keep going. 30 seconds.
Certain behaviors, there are certain functions of life that are a component of God's divine plan mandate. And I could argue it in a secular way for people who don't believe in God or whatever.
Sure.
There's a natural structure of the universe that says to humans, be fruitful and multiply. And these things are important for the efficient structure of such. That being said, we definitely should talk about, we'll talk about Diddy, but I do appreciate it. I thought that was fun.
Okay, so that was the whole video. I don't really have much else to say on it, except your rights are not just ideas, they're your ability to do things. And when the founding people formed the Constitution, they had to look at what would be beneficial for society as a whole, not just one group of people, and areas of liberty versus abuse, right? Where do governments tend to be the most abusive? Well, censoring people, preventing them from having any means of defense against them. Basically, everything they listed about what King George III was doing to the colonies, which is listed in the Declaration of Independence. If you haven't read that document, you should go read it now. And if you haven't read it in a while, it doesn't hurt to read it again. Anyway, that's all I had to say for now. So hope to see you next time. Like, subscribe, and take care.